Hey, this is Elijah with the Oxygen team, and in today's video, we're going to try to rebuild this landing page. This is just a landing page for a book, and the design is really nice and clean, and it has a few cool bits that I'd like to try to replicate on video. So a couple of those are, of course, this little rotating book image. That's kind of nice. It rotates as you scroll down. And then up here in the header, we have a really subtle movement effect for this book image where it moves away from your mouse a little bit as you kind of move things around. That's super cool. Other than that, we have a nice little shape divider. That'll be easy. We can go down and see we have some cool SVG graphics incorporated in the design, which is kind of nice. And if we go all the way down, we have this slider that shows you some testimonials. So I'm just going to work my way through this page from the top, and we'll try to hit as many of these cool bits as we can in the time we have. And just a quick note, the way I found this page was from onepagelove.com, which has a lot of cool one-page websites to look at for inspiration. So if you ever want to just browse some cool designs, this is a great place to do it. So back to this, we're going to build this all as a single page, and I already have an Oxygen install ready to go. So let's jump into the WordPress admin panel and let's create a new page called Book Landing Page, and we'll publish that, and then we're going to jump into Oxygen. All right, so let's jump over to our inspiration site. Starting from the top, we have this kind of sticky banner that stays there along the top as you scroll down. That's really easy to reproduce. We can do it either with a div and fixed positioning, or we can do it with the header builder. The header builder is probably a little bit overkill for this particular item, so we're going to go ahead and just do a fixed div. So let's add a div here. Let's give it a class of top banner, and let's go ahead and set it to 100% width here, and set the background color to that red. Let's go ahead and extract that red here. I have an extension called ColorZilla, which will let me pick the color from the page. Let's grab that color, and we'll be doing a lot of back and forth. We usually do on these builds where I'm trying to replicate another site. So let's save that as a global color because I believe that's used also for the buttons and some of the text here. So we'll try to save any colors that'll be used repetitively in our global colors in Oxygen. So we'll just call that red. Now let's take a look at the text here. I want to make sure that we copy the typography as closely as possible, though if they're using a premium font, I'll probably just try to find something on Google Fonts that's close. So let's see what the font family is here. Platform. I'm not sure if that's a Google font, but let's add some text here. And actually, in looking at this whole thing's a link, so a div won't cut it. We need actually a link wrapper. So we'll just convert this to a link wrapper, and now this whole thing will be clickable. Now let's look at some text here. Let's add a text element, and then let's go ahead and change the text color to white. We know we'll need that. And then let's see if platform is a Google font. It is not, or at least it isn't in the Google Fonts I have loaded here. And if we can't find anything that's exactly what we want, we can just kind of go off the rails a little bit here. So we're just going to go to Manage, Settings, Global Styles, and we'll just pick a normal font pairing, something like Laura maybe, and Merriweather for the text font. We're not going to worry too much about matching the typography exactly here. So we'll do Merriweather. That'll be fine. And then we need a couple of things to happen when we hover this link wrapper. So we're going to want to darken the red a little bit, and then we want the text to be underlined. We also have a box shadow under this banner. So before we jump into the hover styles, let's go ahead and add our box shadow under Advanced Effects, Box Shadow, and then let's pick a dark but not all the way black color, reduce the transparency a bit, and then let's set the horizontal and vertical offsets appropriately, maybe a couple of pixels on the vertical offset, and then we'll adjust the blur to get the effect we want. And sometimes I like to do a negative spread just to de-emphasize the shadow a little bit. And we may adjust this later once we have our other elements that this will overlay. Speaking of that, let's go ahead and set this under Advanced Layout to Position Fixed. This should fix it right at the top of the window. And then let's add some padding. So advanced size and spacing. Let's do like 16 top and bottom. I think that will probably accomplish close to what we want here. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And then what should this text say? Download a free chapter and start winning more customers. So let's go ahead and do that. Download a free chapter now. Now let's go ahead and address our hover styles. So we've got our top banner selected. Let's choose hover, and we'll set the background color to our red initially, and then let's just darken it down a bit. Not that much. Maybe we want to go a little more saturated as we darken it down so it doesn't start getting washed out. And then we'll just save that as a global color, red, dark, so that we can reuse it easily later. Now what we want to do is on hover, we also want to go to advanced typography, and we want to set text decoration to underline. And let's just set our typography color to white. So if we go back to original here, we can see that when we hover our banner, it's going to go ahead and change styles. Now, I think they have a transition duration. It's pretty instant, but it's not actually instant. It's just a short transition duration. So what I like to do for this type of thing where we're going to be using transition duration across multiple elements is just create a utility class. I'll call it transition. And then under advanced effects, we're going to go to transition, and we'll set it to like 0.1 seconds and ease in out. And we'll just set the CSS property to all. So now we should have a smoother transition, though it's still going to be very fast. So we'll go ahead and save our work here, and then let's jump into what the next area will be, which is this hero section. So let's grab the color of the background and the text while we're at it. So we'll pick a color from the page, we'll grab this yellow color, and then let's go ahead and grab the text color as well that's used here because it's not quite black. Now we can go over and use those. So let's add a section, not within our banner. That wouldn't be great. So let's drag that out here and then put the banner back up where it needs to go. It actually doesn't matter where it's at structurally when it comes to the visual representation of the page, but in the markup, it is kind of important that it goes right at the top of the page. So now in this section, we want to use that yellow background color we got from the page that we're replicating. So we're going to go ahead and set the background color to yellow. Now, one thing we could consider here is using a utility class for yellow background sections. I don't think that's necessary because that's really the only setting that we care about on these. So I'm not going to do that for now, but sometimes you'll see like BG-dark and things like that. What we do want to do is save this as a global color. So we'll call it yellow. And then let's add in our heading. So this is going to say culture built my brand. And we might tweak what the text actually says a little bit. So let's say experience built my company. And do we have a period at the end there? We do not. Let's just make this way bigger, like, I don't know, 74. And then let's give ourselves a span here because this text needs to be white. So we'll highlight the text, click span, and then change that text color. Okay, and then this text color needs to be that not quite black color that we grabbed from the example site. So we'll go in and paste that in here, and then we'll make that global color. There we go. That looks pretty good. And if we go ahead and preview it at full width, I think that's going to look just fine. It's not identical, but getting it exactly the same is definitely not something I want to spend a lot of time on here. It's mostly about replicating the interesting bits of the site. So if we jump over here, we have some text below the heading, a button, and then we get into the first interesting bit, which is this book image that moves around as you move your mouse. So let's go ahead and hurry up and get to that part. So let's add some text. And to avoid having to keep changing the text color, let's go to Manage Settings and let's leverage our global styles here. So let's go to Body Text and change the color to our dark gray. And then let's go to Headings and change the color to dark gray as well. We'll save that and then close out the settings menu. Now we can go ahead and make this say some kind of salesy thing like our example site has here. So the secret Secret to incredible success lies within this book. Great. And then let's go ahead and center everything in this section. And then we want a button. So we're going to use a link wrapper, and we'll just style it up to look the way we want it to look. And we'll add a class. We'll call it button, because I think we'll use these maybe a couple more spots throughout the site. So we'll add a class of button, and we'll set the background color to our red color here. And probably on the hover state, we want it to go to that dark red, just like the other hoverable element on the page. And let's add the transition class to give it a transition duration. And then I'm going to go ahead and go to advanced and lock that transition class so I don't accidentally make changes on it later. Now let's go back to the button, and we'll go to typography, and we want everything to be white within this. And then we also want rounded corners. Now this is another one where I like to use a utility class, which I usually just call rounded. This helps me get consistent border radius across multiple elements on the site. So let's go to borders, and we'll set the border radius to 25 pixels. I mean, it's more of a pill shape on the example site, I think. So maybe a bit more. Let's do like 50. Which would be like almost perfectly rounded if it's this small, but when it has some width to it, it should be more of a pill shape. So we'll again go to the advanced tab, and we'll lock these selector styles, because all that class needs to do is handle the border radius. Now let's add an icon, and it's white by default because we set the typography color on the button. Let's look for Amazon. I don't know if we have one in here. We do. That's perfect. And then let's add some text. So it needs to say buy now, and we want it to be fairly bold. So we'll add a bit of text here and change it to say buy now. Now again, since this is within a button, I'd prefer to go ahead and just set the typography styles on the button class itself. So we'll go to typography, and let's change the font weight to 600. And then we also need to do some layout stuff here to lay it out horizontally, center everything, and then we also want to add some padding. So under size and spacing, we'll do like 8 on the top and bottom, and then maybe 32 left and right to get that button shape. Now we need to reduce the size of this icon quite a bit. So let's go down to something like 32, and then let's add some right margin. Under advanced size and spacing, we'll go to margin and add a right margin of maybe 16 pixels. So if we look at the button it's a little bit different. Things are a bit smaller, so we can definitely adjust that down if we'd like. But I think this is probably good enough for now. Now, another thing where I like to use a utility class is on margin between elements vertically. So that's something that usually you want to have pretty consistent. So I'm going to make a class called m-s, which stands for margin small. And that's going to have, under advanced size and spacing, a margin bottom of like 16 pixels. And then I'll have one called m-m, which is margin medium, and that would have a margin bottom of 32 pixels or something like that. So then that gives us some classes that we can use to get our spacing really consistent as our design builds out. So one thing I noticed with my heading is that my line height's a bit too big. So I'm going to go to manage settings. I'm in the global styles here, and I'm going to change the line height to something like 1.2. That looks a little bit better. And then while we're over here, I'm going to jump over to structure, and our little banner div, I'm going to give it a much higher Z index under advanced layout so that it actually shows up, maybe like 100. And then that gives us an idea of how much top padding we want on this section. So let's go to advanced size and spacing and maybe set 128 pixels of padding there. So we've got roughly the same idea going on here. We've got our button. Now we need an image of this book, which I'll probably copy off the site. We need this arrow, this little SVG situation here, and then we need a shape divider here at the bottom. So let's grab the SVG stuff first. So I think on this site, it's all literally just SVG code. So what we can do is we can actually just copy the SVG code into a code block. So we find the SVG element, we right click in DevTools and hit copy and choose copy element. Now we can go into Oxygen and add a code block, and under PHP and HTML, we can just paste that code, apply it, and we have this big shape here. Now, how are we going to get text on top of this? I'm not quite sure yet, but we'll figure something out. I think we can probably just mash everything into a div. So let's add a div here, and let's put the code block within that. And then we do want to adjust the width of the code block to adjust the width of the SVG. So let's see how big this SVG is under the computed tab. Looks like 150 by 150. So knowing that, we can go in and go to the advanced tab on our code block and just use Oxygen's controls to set the size. And we really only need to set the width on this. Now what we need to do is set this code block probably to position absolute, either that or the text. Let's go ahead and add the text. And this text is going to be red, and it's going to be a little bit bigger than 16 pixels, maybe 18, and it's going to be a little heavier than normal. And it's going to say now available. So let's say now available. And I think the easiest way is going to be to set the div that contains these two items to advanced layout, position relative. And then we'll go to primary and make sure everything is centered in this div. And then we can set our text to advanced layout position absolute. And then we can bump this down to 2 lines if we'd like. Make sure there's not a bunch of big spacing there. So that looks pretty close. Now the arrow that we have, I think we can also put in this div. So let's grab the arrow. I think it's also an SVG. So inspect that and find the SVG element, right click, copy, copy element. So let's jump back over here, and we're going to add another code block to our div. And in here, we'll paste the arrow code. And I'm kind of curious about the size. See, that's way too big. So let's see how big this one is. It looks like 125 pixels. So let's go in here to size and spacing and set that to 125. Now we need to absolutely position this so that it doesn't interrupt the layout of everything else, and so that we can put it kind of up and to the right a little bit. So this is going to get a little finicky because we have to manually position this, but that's okay for this element. So let's go to advanced layout, position absolute, and then top, let's do like negative 125 because we want it above the main element. And then we know it's 125 pixels wide, so we can do, on the left-hand side, we can do half of 125, which would be 62.5, I believe. But we also want to adjust this just so that it kind of lines up with that little bump at the top of this SVG. So now we have this whole thing set up. We also need to make sure it's positioned kind of off to the left-hand side. But first, let's get our image in there. So let's right-click and see if we can just grab this image here. There it is. So let's go ahead and copy this link address, or maybe we can just click here and get it. Perfect. So let's copy the image. No, we want to save the image. There we go. Download that, and let's see. I don't think we need anything else at the moment. So we can jump back over to Oxygen and drop this image into our section. So let's add an image element, and let's browse for the image, which isn't there yet. So we need to drop it in and upload it. So let's select that image, and that goes right there where we want it. Now we can probably get our positioning correct on the little cloud and arrow. It needs to be off to the left and down a little bit. So let's see if we can do this with margins. So let's go ahead and go to advanced size and spacing and add like 128 pixels. No, it's going to have to be way more. Let's try 500 pixels. Let's use a percentage instead. If that'll work, let's try. Yeah, that'll work. So let's step that down. This should help us if we go to make this responsive. It should be a little easier to manage. And then the top margin, we want to go down quite a bit here. We can use pixels here. That should be safe to do. And then we're going to need a bunch of negative margin on this book, though we also could use absolute positioning here. So let's try that first so that we're not manipulating too many margins directly. So let's go to advanced layout, position absolute, and then let's set it to 0 pixels on the bottom. Perfect. Now we can add all the margin we need below our button here. So let's go to advanced, and we don't want the button class because we might not want that bottom margin on every button we have. Size and spacing, let's try 128 pixels. That looks a little better. We are going to have to adjust our cloud and arrows since we went with absolute positioning on this book element. Let's see how far down it is. It's pretty close. So let's go down and maybe step that up to 180 pixels. Perfect. Now let's tweak the positioning of this little cloud and arrow situation. We're going to go to advanced size and spacing and back off that top margin quite a bit. Now you can see that it's actually affecting the size of the section, which we can fix easily with some bottom padding, I believe. These kind of layouts can get a little finicky. So let's go down here, and yeah, now we can just drag that book down wherever we want it. Lower, lower, a little bit lower. That's pretty good. And then we also need a shape divider here at the bottom. So let's go to our primary tab of our section and go to add shape divider. Now this needs to be white, and they have kind of a wavy one. So let's choose a wavy one. We have 3 wavy ones by default. That one's a little too tall. Let's see if wavy 3 is a little more uniform. That one's a little better. It's not exactly the same, and actually we could copy the SVG shape they're using probably, but let's go ahead and just go with this one for now. Now it is too tall, so let's drop it down to 150 pixels to give us a little bit more space there. And then let's give it some Z index here. So go down here at the bottom of the primary tab of the properties pane and set the Z index to 99 because we do not want it competing for Z-index with our floating banner up here. So let's go ahead and for the first time in this build, let's go ahead and take a look at the front end and see what everything looks like. So we have our floating banner. Of course, our WordPress admin bar is getting in the way. So we'll take a look on the front end without that eventually. But this looks pretty good. It looks like everything's pretty much where it belongs. And we have our little book. It's behind our shape divider. Now we need to do the interesting part and make this book move when our mouse moves. So this is going to involve some JavaScript. So let's minimize this stuff and let's select our body and drop in a code block. And I want to put this right at the top of our structure. Let's go into PHP and HTML and go ahead and comment that out. And then let's jump over into JavaScript. But first, let's add a class to this book image. Let's call it mover because this book is going to move when we move our mouse. So naturally, it's a mover. So let's go back to our code block, jump into JavaScript and get started. Now, fair warning, this is going to get a little advanced, but I'll walk you through all of it. And of course, I always provide the code in the video's description for you to copy and paste. The first thing we need to do is we need to select all our mover elements so that we can do stuff with them. So we'll do document.query selector all, and then we'll pass in our selector, which is period mover, since it's a class, dot for each, and then we'll do mover and then an arrow function here. Now we want to do something that's specific to running code in Oxygen and preventing in-builder errors. We don't want to run this code if we're in the builder. So we do if window.angular and then return. That keeps everything below that from running in the builder. Now we need to add an event listener for the mouse moving event, which is called mouse move. So we don't want to listen on any particular element, so we'll just add the event listener to the window. So we do window.add event listener, and we're listening for mouse move. And what we want to do with that is have a function that handles that event. So we do an arrow function, and the little e here is just the event object, which allows us to access things like the target of the event and the different attributes of the event that we might need to use, we might not. So another thing we want to do is make sure that since this is going to be running every time the mouse moves, we don't want it to cause a performance problem. So we're going to put all this stuff in like a little timeout slash kind of debounce function. It's not a full debounce, but it still prevents things from bogging down the browser if there are multiple elements moving as a result of this code. So we're going to say if calculating, not calculating, I should say. That's what the little exclamation point there means. So if we're not calculating, we're going to go ahead and do the code that we want to run to make this thing move relative to the mouse position. So we're going to create a variable called calculating, and that's going to be a set timeout. And within that, we just build a little arrow function that does all the stuff we want it to do based on the timing that we pass to it. So the first thing we need to know is the mouse position in the window. So for that, we can set up a variable called window mouse x, and that's going to equal e, that's that little event object that I mentioned earlier, dot client x, which is going to track the x position of the mouse within the window. Then we can do var window mouse y equals e.client y. So now we have the x and y position of the mouse. Now, because we're going to be outputting some CSS as a string on the book image, I like to have a variable that holds all the CSS we're building. So we'll do var computed CSS equals just a blank string for now. If we were manipulating other transforms besides translate X and translate Y here, we could compile it all into computed CSS and then spit it out in the inline style tag on the image to make this a little bit easier for us. And I'm going to catch this typo before I ever go test on the front end and realize it's broken. So now we have those variables set up. Now we need to do some math stuff. So we're going to say var translate X equals window mouse X divided by 32 times -1. Then we're going to do the same for translate y. So var translate y equals window mouse y divided by 32 times -1. This is what gets us those kind of minor movements and gets it moving in the opposite direction of where our mouse is at. So now we can add our translate CSS to the computed CSS variable. So computed CSS plus equals, because we want to add to it, we're going to do transform translate X and then open and close parentheses. And then we're going to concatenate a value in here, which is the value we created a minute ago called translate X. Then we do need to add the px unit there after that. Now we can also add our translate y. So translate y, open and close parentheses, concatenate, translate y, and then add our px value here as well. And then because we could theoretically want to add some more CSS to this eventually, we'll go ahead and add our semicolon there to end that out. And then one at the very end here too. So let's go ahead and wrap this so that we can see what's going on. That should generate the CSS we need for this book image to move. Now we need to apply it to the mover element. So the way we do that is once we've compiled all our computed CSS into a variable, we can go ahead and do mover, which is the object up here that we defined as the object that we selected with the mover class, dot style.css text equals computed CSS. It's just that simple. Now what we want to do for performance reasons is we want to clear our timeout. Calculating. So this timeout, basically what I found is without this timeout, if I had multiple elements moving on the page, they really started bogging down. So this timeout cleared that issue up. So it's kind of just taking care of some performance concerns. And then we can adjust how often we want this movement calculation to run. I'm going to put it at 100 milliseconds, which in my tests earlier was plenty to get a nice smooth movement. Now, if I'm not wrong, that should be everything we need, assuming we didn't have any typos or mistakes, which we'll find out really quickly if we did. So let's jump to the front end and see what happens. So you can see now that this book is moving relative to where my mouse is. So as I move over to the right-hand side, it moves left, up, it moves down, down, it moves up, and left, it moves right. So this is a very similar, if not identical, effect to what they have going on here. Their movement might be a little bit more subtle than mine. But I also notice, and I wonder if mine's doing this too, that there's some JavaScript constantly running up here. I'm not really sure Why? That's a little concerning. I don't think that's happening on our version of the page, but let's see. I'm kind of curious if maybe the code that I use is doing anything similar. I don't see anything getting edited constantly. Really, the only thing that's changing is the transform values on that image when I move the mouse. When I'm not moving the mouse, nothing's happening. So that's exactly what we want. So that's the first really interesting bit on this site. Now we can move on to the next section, which is pretty basic. And in fact, I would probably skip this section if it weren't for the fact that this little rotation effect kind of depends on having that white section and then a yellow section. So let's jump over here and add a section to our design. And we want to move it down below the first one. And here we can add some text. So let's just do some text that's red, and we'll probably do bold, and then we'll bump up the text size. I'm not sure how big their text is. It's pretty big. So let's bump it up here to maybe 24 pixels. And then we'll add a little bit of a headline here, unleash the power of your culture. Let's say, unleash your ultimate potential and propel yourself into space. Perfect. Now, what I noticed they did here, which is really a good idea, is they limited the width of these elements. Let's look at how they did that. I would expect it to maybe be within a div. Yes, there is a div here, and it has a maximum width probably set. So if we scroll down here, we can see min width, yeah, it's just set to 640 pixels width. So we'll do the same thing on ours. We can either add a class to the text elements to restrict their width, or we can add a div. Maybe I don't want to add another div when I don't need it. So let's just add a narrow text class. And we'll go to advanced size and spacing and set max width to, what was there, 640 pixels? Yes, 640. 640. So now we just need to add another text element with a couple of paragraphs. So I'm going to use text expander to put in ellipsum 2 paragraphs. And then we want to add our narrow text class to this as well. And while we have it on there, we'll go ahead and lock it because again, it's got one job and we don't want it to do anything else. So under advanced, we can go down and lock the selector styles and then select the ID so that we can style it if we want. This is going to need a bit of margin here. So we'll use one of our margin classes. We'll do MS. And then this section, we want to center everything. Except for the text, we don't want it to be centered like that. So let's lock this margin small class. And then let's go back to the text block typography and make sure it's all aligned left. Advanced typography. Aligned left. Perfect. So now we have this really boring bit of text set up. We can do this interesting rotation effect next. So there's a couple of considerations here. Do we want the image to actually be in the white section or the yellow section? I don't think it matters much, but I do think it's a little bit easier to get the layout where you want it if we put it in the yellow section and add a negative top margin. So let's go over there and do that. We're going to add a section and we're going to set the background color to our brand yellow here. And then let's go over here and save this image off. So I'm going to inspect that and see if we can go ahead and grab this image from their server. I'm going to save it as, and now we can go back and drop this in. So add an image and we're going to browse for that and drop it in to upload it to the site and then select the image. That's perfect. Now what we probably need to do is center it, but let's look at what else we have. So we do want it centered. This stuff's all centered, so that's good. Let's get rid of this. Their JavaScript is spazzing out there. So we do want the text centered, and then we're going to have a couple of columns here. So that'll all be good. So that being the case, I think we can jump over here and go ahead and start laying this out. So let's center everything. I feel like this image is a little bit bigger than they have it. So let's look again. Don't mind the flashing JavaScript stuff. And let's look at the computed styles. It's about 600 pixels wide. So let's try using that here. Let's do 600. Yeah, that looks better. Now what we want to do is we want to remove the top padding from the yellow section. We'll probably add some to the white section, but we want a negative top margin on this book image. So under size and spacing, we can go to top margin and do like negative 128 pixels or something like that. I think that it's actually about halfway between the two sections. So we'll step it up quite a bit until it just looks right. Something like that will probably work. Now we can adjust the bottom padding here on the white section to make sure that it falls where it needs to. Now, before we go any further, let's go ahead and add, let's say, a heading. We'll do an H2 here. And we'll make it red. And then let's change it to about the authors. And then add some more text below that. And this is going to be maybe 18 pixels. Let's make it actually black. I think that's what they did over here. And then we'll add one paragraph of lorem ipsum. And then we'll probably want to add that narrow class again to keep it from being so wide. Let's see if I can click it that time. Perfect. And that's a bit more text than I think they have. So we can actually just step that down a bit to about there. And now let's use our margin classes. So we'll do like a medium margin on the bottom of that. And then this image, we'll just add a custom margin on the bottom. We'll do 64 pixels. That looks all right. So now that we have some space to scroll, we can add our rotation effect. So let's add a class called spinner, because that's what it's going to do. It's going to spin as we scroll down. And next we need to go into our code block. The same place where we established our JavaScript for the first book image, we can just go below that and we can add the JavaScript for the spinner image. This one's going to be quite a bit simpler. So basically we want to do window.add event listener, and we're listening for a scroll event. We're going to do a little arrow function here. And within that function, we want to, again, return if window.angular is true. So window.angular return. And then we can go down and do a document.query selector all. And we're going to look for those spinner elements. We only have one, but I'm building this so that if we had multiple elements with the spinner class, they would all spin as you scroll. And then we're going to do a for each spinner, little arrow function again, and then we're going to go down and do some stuff as we scroll. So basically all we need to do here is set the transform rotate on this spinner element. So we'll do spinner.style.css text. Again, much simpler than what we did before. Transform rotate. And then we're going to concatenate some stuff in here. We can just do the math straight in here since it's a little simpler. So we want to rotate by a number of degrees, which we will define as -20, because we want to start a little bit rotated to the left, plus, and then we'll contain this in parentheses as well, window.scroll y divided by 16 to keep it from just spinning out of control. And that should do the trick. So let's save that, or actually apply it and see if any errors pop up. Nope. Let's save it and jump to the front end and see this effect. So again, we got our fixed banner here at the top. We've got our book image that moves around relative to our cursor position. We've got a button. We scroll down, we've got our little shape divider. And if we scroll down, we should have a book image that's rotating. Now, because it's further down the page, we can adjust its starting position to make sure that it's kind of upright by the time it reaches the middle of our screen. So the way we can do that is adjust this -20 to something a bit more like -120. That may be way too much, but let's see what it looks like. So scroll back to the top, refresh, and scroll down. And that's not too bad, but it's a little bit far. So let's go to 80 degrees, -80 degrees. And then let's scroll up and refresh and scroll down. And now you can see that as it comes into view, it's kind of upright. So that's kind of nice. And then it continues to spin as we scroll past it. So that adds a nice bit of visual interest. These little subtle effects like this are really, really neat because they're not really hindering the user experience at all, but they still add a lot of visual interest. I'm really not a fan of websites that just like hijack the entire scrolling experience, but stuff like this adds a little bit of flavor and can really elevate the design. So I think we've about exhausted the time we have for this video, but we did accomplish the two main cool things that I wanted to replicate from our example site, which is this spinning book picture and then the book picture that kind of moves around as you move your mouse. And both of these were accomplished with about, let's look, how many lines of JavaScript did we add? 39 lines of vanilla JavaScript. So no jQuery, no external libraries, really no bloat for these really minor effects that we wanted to accomplish in our design. So again, this is Elijah with the Oxygen team, and that's how to build a book landing page with some really nice, subtle, bloat-free motion effects. Thank you very much for watching.